Hi everyone, Tom here from Front End Beginners, and in this video we'll look at how to apply background gradients in CSS. I've created 3 divs here and given them a 2-pixel black border and a grey background, which we'll replace with our background gradients. The most commonly used gradient is a linear gradient, where the background changes from one colour to another along a straight line. For our first div, let's start with the most simple of linear gradients. We'll start by targeting our first div, which has an ID of div1. Next, we'll use the background property with a value of linear-gradient followed by a pair of parentheses. Inside our parentheses, we need to provide just 2 parameters. The first is the colour we'd like our gradient to start from, and the second is the colour we'd like our gradient to end with. We separate the 2 colours with a comma. The 2 colours you enter inside the parentheses can be in the form of CSS colour keywords, hex codes, or RGB values. For this first example, and to keep things simple, let's use black and white. So first we'll type the colour keyword black, followed by a comma to separate it from the next value, where we'll type the keyword white. If we preview this in the browser, we'll see that our first div now has a black to white linear gradient running from top to bottom. Top to bottom is the default direction for a CSS linear gradient, but fortunately this can easily be changed. So let's use our second div to look at how we change the direction of our linear gradients. Let's start by targeting our second div, which has an ID of div2. Use the background property again and give it a value of linear-gradient and a pair of parentheses. This time we'll add a third parameter, which comes before the 2 colours. This parameter sets the direction of our gradient. For this, we can use either a specific degree value or we can use CSS directional keywords. Let's start with directional keywords. Inside the parentheses, I'm going to type 2 space right, followed by a comma to separate it from the colours, and then I'll type my starting colour of black, another comma, and my end colour of white. What we've done here is instruct the browser to display a black to white linear gradient that travels from left to right. Let's preview this in the browser. You can see that our start colour, black, is on the left of our div, and the gradient travels to the right of our div, ending on white. The toDirectional command accepts the standard CSS position properties of top, bottom, left or right, as well as combinations of these such as top left, top right and bottom right. For example, let's change our command to read to top left. We can now see that our gradient is travelling towards the top left corner of our element, where it starts on black and ends on white. Let's now move on to using a degree value. So inside our parentheses, instead of 2 top left, I'm going to remove this and for this example type 45 DEG, 45 degrees. Again, we use the comma to separate the degree value from our start colour and our end colour. If we preview this in the browser, you'll see that our gradient is travelling to the top right corner of our div, starting on black and ending on white. This is because our degree value is effectively the position that we want our gradient to end. If you imagine the word to before 45 degrees, this won't work by the way, this is just to demonstrate. We're telling the gradient to travel from black to white to a position of 45 degrees. If we change this to 90 degrees, you'll see that the gradient now ends on the right hand edge of our div. It's travelling from black two 90 degrees, with 0 being the top, 90 being the right. The degree value allows you to be very specific with the direction of your gradient, which may be useful in some situations. Often, however, the directional keywords are enough to create the look you are going for. Another thing you can do with linear gradients is to affect the transition from your start to end colours in terms of how far along the gradient this change actually happens. Think of the gradient line in terms of percentages. In our previous examples, we're going from black at 0%, the start, to white at 100%, the end. Let's actually type these percentage values into our CSS. We'll use the second div with the direction as to right, just for simplicity. And then we'll say black 0%, so we want black to be the start, and white 100%. So white is at the far end. Looking in the browser, obviously our transition remains the same. 0% and 100% are the default values for our two colours. If we don't explicitly specify percentages, these will just default to the first colour being 0% and the second colour being 100%. If we wanted our gradient to remain black further along into the transition, so it doesn't become grey here in the middle, and it remains black to around this halfway point in our div, we could adjust the black start point. So let's change the start point for black from 0%, or the very beginning, the left edge of our div, to 50%. You can now see, rather than starting at the left edge of 0, or the beginning of the element, the gradient begins halfway along the length of the element at 50%. Further to this, we can also add additional colours in between our start and end colours. If we reset our start point to 0%, and then add another colour in between black and white, for example, after this comma here, let's put blue, followed by a comma, so we now have black at 0%, blue, and white at 100%. If we look in the browser, you'll see that we now have a gradient going from black at the start, blue in the center, and white at the end. We can affect the position of the blue portion of our gradient by giving it a percentage value as well. For example, let's set blue to 25%, which sets its position in the gradient to 25% or a quarter of the distance of the total gradient. Short transitions, such as 25% in this instance, between two very different shades, so black and this blue, often results in an obvious line, as you can see here in the gradient, which may or may not be the effect you're looking to achieve. So just be aware of this. That pretty much sums up the basics of linear gradients, so let's look at another type of gradient, the radial gradient. Rather than following a straight line, a radial gradient starts from a certain position and radiates out from it in a circular or elliptical pattern. Let's target our third div, div 3, use the background property, and this time give it a value of radial gradient and parentheses. Much like the linear gradient, the parentheses for our radial gradient can take just two parameters as a minimum, the start and end colours. Let's stick with our black and white example just for the sake of clarity. So we'll put in black, comma, white. If we preview this in the browser, you'll see that we have a radial gradient emanating from the center point of our div and gradually becoming white around the far edges of the container. By default, if no other parameters are used, the radial gradient will be the shape of an ellipse, an elongated or stretched out circle. It will begin in the center of the element and it will end at the furthest edge away from center, in this case the left and right edges. So it's black in the center and gradually becomes white as it reaches the furthest edge away from center. We can use CSS keywords to affect each of these different properties. Let's begin with the shape. We have two options for this: circle or ellipse, with ellipse being the default. If we add the word circle followed by a comma at the beginning of our parentheses and preview this in the browser, we'll see that the shape of our gradient has now changed to a circle rather than an elongated ellipse. Next, we can tell our gradient where we want it to be positioned, or more specifically, where we want it to begin. This accepts the standard position keywords of top, bottom, left, right, and center, as well as combinations of these, e.g. top left, bottom center, etc. The default position is center, center. After the shape parameter, before the comma, let's type at right. So we have a circle gradient at right. If we preview this in the browser, you'll see that we've instructed our CSS to create a circular gradient that starts at the right of our element. Although this looks very similar to a linear gradient, but it is actually circular. If we change this to at bottom left, we'll see that it changes its position accordingly. Our circle is now at the bottom left of our element, and the gradient is emanating from that position in all directions, ending at the furthest edge away from this point. Lastly, let's affect the end point, or the size of our gradient. By default, the gradient will stretch out to the farthest side of its element. We can use the following keywords to change this: closest side, closest corner, farthest corner, or we can specify a specific radius using a numeric pixel or relative units value. To demonstrate how this works, let's reset our radial gradient parameters to circle, black, white. So we'll remove this at position. We now have this circle in the center, starting as black and ending at white at the farthest edge. As we haven't specified a size parameter, it's using the default farthest side. Our gradient stretches out from the center to the farthest side of its element. This gives a very subtle extended transition from black to white. If we now change our parameters to circle space closest dash side, you'll see how this changes things. Our gradient begins in the center as black, but it now ends as white at the closest side of its container element, which in this case is the top or bottom. Because it's no longer stretching out to the farthest side, the gradient is much shorter and more abrupt, and the entire outside of the div is filled with white, which is the gradient end color. To make this a little bit more clear to differentiate from the white background, let's change the colors to dark blue and light blue. You can see a little more clearly now how this works. The gradient now ends in all directions at the distance from center to the closest edge, which makes this almost like a perfect circle, and the rest of the container element is filled with the end color. As you can see from these few examples, background gradients can be as simple or as complex as you want them to be. Once you understand the basics, it's fairly easy to create your own gradients using CSS. I encourage you to play around with different gradient types, different parameters, and to use different colors. However, if you prefer a more visual interface, there's a great free tool at cssgradient.io that lets you enter a few values and visually create a gradient that you can then copy and paste into your CSS. This is a quick and easy way to create the gradient you need for your project, but it always pays to understand how this works. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as soon as possible. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.